Are you tired of your runs looking like this? Do you want a bunch of this?
Nice.
Well, look no further. Today, I'm going to be giving you the most OP builds that I know for Lancelot, as well as give some tips and tricks on how I think you should be optimizing Lancelot and the best situations, the builds, etc. that you should be using for him. Now, before we get into it, this will be probably the last time I talk about damage cap as a PSA, but let's just briefly talk about what makes a character's damage go up and down and really unlock their true potential. Now, not to kind of spoil what's going to be in this build, but let's just talk about why this damage cap thing is so important. Number one, without damage cap, you aren't able to really see how much damage a character does, and unfortunately or fortunately, that means that you kind of have to revolve your entire build around including about 65 levels worth of damage cap. Now, I know you're probably wondering what this is, but hear me out for a second. Now, if you're really min-maxy and you want to get the most out of your build, there is actually a bit of an alternate route that we can talk about here that is technically the best in slot when it comes to affording damage and trying to get damage cap mixed along everything else in your kit. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of this, I just want to preface, this is extremely difficult to get, so viewer discretion is advised. As I just mentioned, the stat that we're trying to get is 65 damage cap, which is really important. And there's a couple ways that you could get it, namely like getting damage cap as a sigil. However, something that you can do is actually put damage cap as a trait on stuff like your imbue or your right stone, or put it on something like your character sigil and use it as an alternative trait. If you take a look at what we have here, you can see that one of the damage sigils will definitely have to be committed just as its own kind of sigil. You have to use it as the main stat. That means that one damage sigil will definitely have to be implemented. But for some of the other bonuses that we get for damage cap, which again is really important for hitting the damage cap, you can see that we actually get 5 levels or trait levels worth of damage cap from the terminus weapon, which again, spoiler, I apologize, but you can take a look at this later. But if we move along, you can actually see that you can get 2 damage caps as secondary traits on your character sigil and your critical rate sigil if you're playing Lancelot. And just between all the stats that we just talked about prior to this, you've already got level 50 damage cap without having to commit 3 or 4 damage cap sigils. Furthermore, there's a trait that is associated with terminus weapons, which is called Sigil Booster, and with it you're given 3 levels, which is obviously really good. And finally, the reason why this build is super hypothetical is because technically speaking, you can find a right stone with both a 7 damage cap and a 5 damage cap on it, totaling out to 12, and when you put all the numbers together, it perfectly adds up to 65 damage cap. With all of this, you don't have to worry about damage cap as individual main stat sigils or finding damage cap as a main stat sigil. However, again, at the end of this all, it is extremely difficult to find this build. Now, I apologize, I kind of went a little bit deep on there. I just wanted to kind of get the PSA out beforehand, but let's just talk about what exactly the makeup of a build or a really decent or versatile build in the endgame is. You've got your damage traits like Stamina, Tyranny, and Link Together. You've got your supportive traits like Uplift, Cascade, and Quick Cooldown. To survive a little bit easier, you also have stuff like Nimble Onslaught, Guts, Potion Hoarder, and Firm Stance as defensive traits. And finally, the miscellaneous trait or the character trait that is kind of associated with each individual character and is special specifically to them is also an option that you can take when you're filling out everything outside of the damage cap. You're more than welcome to honestly choose whichever traits that you want. If you want to play with a little bit more HP, or you want to play with like a little bit more invincibility, or if you want to play more with guard, that's totally up to you. And that's kind of the way the build that I just mentioned is super nice, and that's primarily because you have so much flexibility. You have endless slots to kind of get extra stats like Nimble Onslaught or Nimble Defense, and you can associate or get those sigils whenever you want. But I do want to make a brief mention of Lancelot's sigil, or his character sigil specifically, because it is a little weird. Now, if you see here, there's a White Dragon's Glory sigil that you can obtain, and it reads that you gradually boost the damage of each successive hit. Now, if you look at the actual details of this says that it boosts damage dealt by a max of 50%. If you look at White Dragon's Oath, you can see that you gain additional movement range with your right click, or I guess whatever the button is for controller, but it's basically your short dash that also deals damage. But interestingly enough, if you take a look at Combo Booster, it kind of looks identical, if not just way better, technically speaking, than White Dragon's Glory. And there's only technically one kind of scenario that I can think of where White Dragon's Glory is a little more justifiable to be used, or you could maybe justify picking it. And the only use case that I can think of where this is maybe a little bit more useful is if you're trying to add another damage oriented or an orange sigil. If you take a look at some of these like Combo Booster, Link Together, Tyranny, Stamina, you'll see that the orange sigils actually can't be paired together. So that means that something like stamina and tyranny can't be linked together. Ironically, and not a pun, linked together can also not be together with combo booster. You get the idea. Now, the main advantage that you may have if you're trying to use White Dragon's Glory is that, technically speaking, if you want to still have the damage boost, is that if you still want the 50% damage boost, you can technically have something like weak point damage or stamina or, you know, tyranny, one of these other damage related sigils put specifically on White Dragon's Glory, so that you can have both the 50% damage boost as well as this additional orange damage sigil. That being said though, since the damage cap is usually reached pretty quickly, there isn't really a need for you to have tyranny or stamina, anything like that. Usually you can just afford to have stamina plus nimble assault and then guts plus, you know, tyranny, whatever you want. Now there is one trait that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's the stat trait. And kind of similar to the character trait, this stat trait shares a similarity to the character sigils in the sense that you can actually pair this critical hit rate with literally any sigil in the game. So that means if you want critical hit rate and link together, critical hit rate in guts, critical hit rate and nimble onslaught, you can totally do that. But for the sake of playing Lancelot, this is 99.99999% of the time likely just going to be allocated to crit. Now, if you want to take a quick look at my Lancelot build, this is kind of the sigil breakpoint or the sigil makeup that I have for my character. I've got about 30,000 HP, a little bit north of 25,000 attack, I've got 75 crit rate, and I've also got 142 stun power. And in all honesty, guys, I kind of had a little bit of a boo-boo where I forgot to save, and then I lost my second supplementary damage 5, but I actually wanted that over the additional link together at the bottom. And of course, if I could ever find a supplementary damage 5 plus, well, more power to me whenever I find that, but that's like 1 in a million. Now, the reason that I'm actually showing my build and not just giving you some hypothetical best in slot, in all honesty, guys, between trying to get damage cap on all of these random, you know, character sigils and finding double damage cap on your weapon, it's pretty unrealistic. And especially if you're trying to afford, or especially if you're trying to find supplementary damage 5 plus an additional trait, these are all really unrealistic kind of scenarios that you're trying to look out for. And to be honest with you, something might just come out before you even reach this end goal. So let's talk about what is pretty realistic, or what an average setup will look like. Now, for the setup, we have 4 damage sigils, and as you can see, we've got stuff like guts, we've got nimble onslaught, we've got improved dodge, etc, etc. And ultimately, or unfortunately, if you take a look at this, we will actually overcap a little bit, just 4 over for the damage cap, which is the reason why, hypothetically speaking, you want the other build, because it doesn't overcap. But it's really difficult to min-max this, so like, don't lose your mind over this. If we move to the rest of the build though, it actually kind of comes down to personal preference. Now, some things that I really like: Potion Hoarder, because I'm not running auto revive anymore because I don't like the really long stand-up mechanic, but ultimately if you want that, you could run that. However, for me, I run a max Potion Hoarder because I want the additional potion revives, and then I get to get back up and I don't have to wait for like the really slow animation. I have Nimble Onslaught and Nimble Defense because, in all honesty, having the additional invincibility frames is crazy. I think right now, or in my ideal build, once I get my second supplementary damage, I should be, I think, about 8 seconds worth of invincibility, which is, again, insane. 8 seconds. Count that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. What? Huh? How's that even what? Is that even real? And for me personally, I like having additional dodges because I sometimes don't really like just running around. So I gave myself improved dodge at level 15. This, in addition to guts, is what I actually think makes up the utility and kind of the supportive kind of self-buffing aspect of my kit. But again, feel free to choose what you like. If you want auto revive, if you want something like Aegis or Garrison, by all means, you can definitely kind of mess around to see how much health you can pull and get or take, or maybe you want something else that has to do with like dodging. But long story short, outside of the damage cap, and so long as you hit max damage, just choose what you like. You can also just follow what I like, because this is what I find to be the most flexible for damage. It works for a lot of content. That's how I selected my build. Now, if we move along to skills, there's a reason why I've specifically chosen the list that I have here. And let's just go through the skills real quick. The first skill that we have is this word that I'm gonna call it Dolch. Blower Dolch. That's probably not even right, but it gives you supplementary damage. And if you aren't familiar with supplementary damage at this point, it exceeds or it goes beyond the damage cap built into the game. So this is pretty much a no-brainer. This is really, really important, especially for Lancelot. It's really important for most characters in the game. Definitely take this skill. If we read Southern Cross, it reads as a fast multi-hit that is chainable into a normal attack combo. And the reason why this is so good is because it does a load of damage. It's kind of just your bread and butter damage combo. In my opinion, Blower Dolch and Southern Cross are pretty much never going to be taken off of your hotbar. And honestly, the last skill that we have to talk about is Blade Impulse, because technically speaking, if the boss moves around, which most of them do, this is pretty mandatory as well, just because, again, you can chain it into a normal combo, and it also allows you to dash far distances, which is really important for damage uptime. Now, we skipped over Turbulence, and that's mainly because this really isn't a core, and you're kind of forced to flex between Turbulence, Kautz Winger, allowing I can't say this. Basically, your ranged auto attack, your stun that allows you to freeze, really, really OP, by the way, if you're trying to prolong certain phases or stun the boss, and basically just mirror image if you're just afraid of getting one shot. And I'll just be honest with you guys, if you're giving the rest of your team your gauge, I mean, I guess you're padding your honor stats. I don't really think this is that good, though. Personally, I would rather just play greedy, because that's kind of how Lancelot works. But just so you're aware, I will go through some of the scenarios where I think flexing between some of the other skills is better. The first one that I have here is Turbulence, and I think, in all honesty, when you aren't able to stun the boss, I think this is probably the best one for you. I really enjoy taking this one into a character like Vulcan Bola. I don't know if I'm just really unlucky or something is going on, but I've never really been able to stun that guy, and that's pretty much the only time that I take Turbulence. Alternatively, if I'm playing solo and I know that I'm taking characters that have stuns, and I'm just trying to get out as much damage as possible, I don't really trust my AI that much to min-max their damage, so I will also probably take Turbulence in scenarios like that. For Kautz Winger, this is pretty much your go-to skill no matter what. It's a stun, and honestly, it also does damage at the same time, which is kind of luxurious. You would kind of expect the skill not to do damage, but it is okay-ish damage, not the greatest, not the highest amount of damage in the world, but being able to free someone and being able to do this during certain things like overdrive and stuff is super, super critical if you want to get fast clears. This is pretty much what you're going to take against pretty much every single boss in the game, except for maybe like Griffins or ranged characters and Vulcan Bola. The final thing that I honestly don't even think is that worth mentioning is the Law range skill. Now, as you can see, it's a ranged attack, and that's fine in theory if you're trying to fight against like certain ranged characters at first. But to be honest with you, I kind of wouldn't farm, or I wouldn't just use Lancelot at all against a lot of ranged characters. I'm not going to go too in depth with this because I have an entire section later that goes into when I think Lancelot is really good. But long story short, if you have a ranged character and you are a die-hard Lancelot main, you could definitely, I guess, spec in Law. But most characters in the game don't stay up in the air for like 9 years, so if anything, it's probably just worth holding your L, waiting for it to get dropped by something, and then, or like throwing it like a ranged, bomb or something at it, and then just hitting it once it's landed on the ground. To be honest, for Masteries, there isn't really much to talk about in terms of offense or defense. You want to max both. Preferentially or preferably like kind of like a healthy mix between the two. But in all honesty, if you're ever struggling with something mastery related, I would just turn on the auto assist mode. Unless if you're like a speedrunner or something, in which case I guess just again upgrade them at the same time, because sigil costs are reduced and they're not as expensive, especially later on. And sigil costs are kind of similar, and then once you get to the point where you're at about 80% for both, then you start encountering the really expensive sigils, but it's better than just using 30,000 mastery points for like the last 4 traits or for the last like 4 nodes on an offense, when you could just get literally the entire defensive tree in exchange for it. To touch on collection for a moment, this is kind of the similar offense-defense debate. Long story short, just upgrade everything, because again, they all apply to each other. Spoiler, we can include the spoiler tag here. Don't show the final weapon if you don't want to see this. But essentially, you gain a bunch of health, you gain stats at the end of all these things, and you're going to have to upgrade them all at some point. Arguably, I guess if you want more survivability and you're being carried, you can commit to Kiara. I'm terrible at naming this stuff, guys. But in any case, upgrading health might be kind of useful, and if you want more damage, maybe you could invest in the critical hit damage one, but you're going to upgrade all of them at some point anyways, so it doesn't really matter that much. And finally, for Overmastery, I will talk about arguably the most important mastery thing of all, which is honestly just hitting the 3 caps. Now, you don't see it here, but there are technically, I believe, 4 caps that are available to be taken. It's the healing cap, it is the normal attack damage cap, the Skybound Arts cap. I think there's a chain, there might be a chain It might be 5. I actually don't know if I've seen all of them together. I don't think I've ever seen them all together, which is why I have it like this. But ideally, what I think is really important is the skybound damage cap, the normal attack damage cap, and the skill damage cap. Those, in my opinion, are really important because especially when you're trying to get a speedrun clear, you want your skybound arts or your ultimates to do as much damage as possible. And if it wasn't obvious enough, skills and attacks, your left clicks and your skills do an insane amount of damage, so they are definitely worth investing in when it comes to damage caps. And you'll notice, especially later on, and this is maybe not so much the case early on, the damage increases themselves literally do nothing. Once you start hitting the hypothetical damage cap, all you are looking for across everything when it comes to sigil, like playstyle, supplementary damage, etc., is you're just looking for a way to exceed the damage cap, and your overmastery is another way for you to do it. So even though in theory it could be nice to say get 20%, you know, skill damage up or gain 1,000 attack power, honestly, these are just kind of excessive, and you'll probably hit the damage cap just from stamina and tyranny anyways. So try and look for damage cap, especially early on. And if you want something like stun power because you want to do more damage or break the boss easier, consider that as well. However, I think damage cap is the most important stat that you can look for when it comes to your overmastery bonuses. Okay, now finally, let's talk about when you're supposed to or when it's ideal to pick Lancelot. The short answer is pretty much at any time. I think this character is insane. He's got a lot of potential. He's got utility. He's really elusive. He's kind of hard to hit, in all honesty, especially if you're actually good at the game. And in all honesty, guys, even though sometimes fighting against ranged characters is annoying, that doesn't really stop you from being able to just wait a second or having someone else on your team knock down the opponent or freeze the boss or stun the boss and then you being able to hit them. Arguably, pretty much any time the boss is stunnable, you kind of want Glaciate. If you compare something like Paralyze to Glaciate, there are some scenarios where you can't actually Paralyze or Paralyze is weaker than Glaciate. In most scenarios that I've seen, it feels like you're able to Glaciate certain bosses easier or they stay stunned or, you know, frozen for longer compared to Paralyze. I could just be imagining this though, guys, because I don't really know why, but they don't include like the exact seconds for how long stuns are. However, again, long story short, if you want to stun a boss, take Lancelot. Now, as I mentioned before, for when you're not really wanting to take Lancelot, you don't really want to take him against characters that can't be stunned. So in this case, it's probably a no-go against Vulcan Bola. If you have to fight against flying characters, I think it's like some of the dragons or some of the flying characters like griffins are definitely not worth fighting for you. But ultimately, if this is your first time running through, you don't really have a choice, so you might as well just play the character you have highest leveled. Just play Lancelot. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed or you learned something. If you did, make sure to like, comment, turn the notification bell, subscribe. Let me know what you think about Lancelot, if you think he's good, if he's bad. If you appreciate this sort of content, feel free to let me know. If you have any other questions, feel free to join the Discord and ask me, or pretty much DM me on any platform that you see me on. Thank you so much for supporting the content recently, guys. I really do sincerely appreciate it. If you want to suggest or comment down below something or a guide or whatever you want to see, feel free to let me know as well. Again, I've been streaming pretty regularly on Twitch and YouTube for especially content relating to Granblue. If you want to check out or ask questions there, feel free to do so as well. But that's going to be it for this video, guys. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching. Adios.